There's a version of this story where I walk into that restaurant, see him sitting there with his new girlfriend, and I make a scene. I throw my drink. I say something cutting and cinematic that gets 40 million views on its own. That's not what happened. What happened is quieter than that, and it's better. I want to take you to a Tuesday night 18 months from where this story starts. I'm standing outside a restaurant in a coat I bought with money I earned doing something I taught myself from scratch, in a body I rebuilt one uncomfortable morning at a time, with a phone full of people who actually call me back. And through the window, I see him, my ex. The one who told me 4 different times in 4 different ways that I was fine, that I was a lot, that he just needed someone a little more put together. He's on a date. She's lovely. That's not the point. I remember the exact texture of that evening, the cool bite of early autumn air, the streetlight flickering slightly above the restaurant's awning, the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses drifting through the propped open door. I wasn't dressed up for any occasion. I was simply on my way home from a work dinner with my design team, laughing about something a coworker had said when I glanced through the window out of pure idle habit and saw him. The point is what happened in my own chest when I saw him. Nothing. Not the void kind of nothing, not the numb kind, the full kind of nothing. The kind where there's simply no more room left for him to occupy, because I filled every corner of that space with my own life. I didn't walk in, I didn't wave, I didn't need him to see me. But he did anyway. And for 3 full seconds, through a pane of glass, I watched a man realize exactly what he gave up. I didn't scream, I didn't fight back. I just became someone he never expected. This is the story of how I got there. Not the 3 seconds by the window, but the 18 months before it. The unglamorous, unfilmed, unwitnessed months where I was nobody's love story and nobody's cautionary tale. Just a woman, alone in an apartment that smelled like instant noodles and ambition, deciding quietly, privately, with no audience at all, that I was going to become someone I actually liked. If you're watching this because someone made you feel small, stay with me. This isn't a video about him. It's a video about you. Hey, if this is your first time here, I tell true first-person stories about the quiet kind of revenge. The kind with no shouting, no confrontation, no viral comeback line. Just transformation so real it speaks for itself. Because here's the thing I want you to understand before we go one more minute into this story. This isn't about revenge. Not really. Revenge implies he's still the main character. He's not. He was the catalyst. The story, the whole story, is about becoming. Becoming the version of you that was always in there, waiting for a reason ugly enough to finally let her out. I get messages constantly from people who found this channel after their own version of a hallway moment, a text that ended a relationship, a comment overheard at a family dinner, a performance review that cut deeper than it should have. And what I always tell them is the same thing I want to tell you now, before we even get into the details of my own story. The version of you that gets built in the 18 months after your lowest point isn't a mask you put on to fool anyone. It's not a costume, and it's not a performance for an audience that may or may not ever see it. It's simply what happens when you finally, fully commit to yourself, without conditions, without an exit strategy, without waiting for anyone's apology first. That's the difference between a glow-up that fades within the few months of the initial anger, the kind fueled entirely by spite that burns hot and dies out the second the spite has nowhere left to go, and a transformation that actually holds, that becomes simply who you are permanently, regardless of whether your ex or your doubters or anyone else ever notices. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe before we go further. I release one of these every week, and I promise you, the middle of this one is going to hit you somewhere you didn't know was still tender. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to who I was before any of this started.
I need to tell you who I was before, because if I don't, you won't understand how far the distance actually was. I was 29 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment in a city I'd moved to for a relationship, working a job I'd taken because it was stable, not because I wanted it. I wanted to be honest with you about something most glow-up videos skip over. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I was unhappy in a slow way. The kind of unhappy that doesn't announce itself. It just sits on your chest a little more every morning until one day you realize you've stopped recognizing your own face in photos. I had been with Daniel for 4 years. I want to tell you about a specific dinner, about 8 months before the engagement party, because I think it captures the texture of those final years better than any general description could. We were at a restaurant celebrating my birthday. I'd ordered a slice of chocolate cake to split, something we used to do happily in the early years. When it arrived, Daniel looked at it, then looked at me, and said lightly, almost as a joke, "Are you sure? We just had a big dinner." I remember the exact way my stomach dropped. I said just as lightly, "It's my birthday. I think I can have cake." And we both laughed it off, and I ate the cake, and it tasted like nothing. But I thought about that comment for weeks afterward. I started, without fully admitting it to myself, monitoring what I ordered when we ate out together. I started declining dessert preemptively, before he could say anything, just to avoid that particular flavor of casual scrutiny. Looking back, I can trace a direct line from that "are you sure" to the woman standing in the hallway 6 months later, silently agreeing that she needed to become more put together. I'm not going to spend this video tearing him apart, because that's not the point of this channel, and honestly, it's not even accurate. Daniel wasn't a villain, he was just a man who wanted a certain kind of life, and somewhere along the way I had quietly rearranged myself to fit into the shape of what he wanted, instead of asking whether it fit me. I stopped going out with my friends because he didn't like when I came home late. I stopped taking the pottery class I loved because he called it a phase. I gained weight during a stressful year at work, and he never said anything cruel outright. He just started suggesting restaurants with salads on the menu, started commenting on his coworkers' discipline at the gym, started leaving his running shoes by the door, like a hint I was supposed to pick up. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. That's what those 4 years were. And then came the moment, the one that, looking back, was actually a gift, even though it didn't feel like one for a long, long time. We were at his cousin's engagement party. I'd bought a new dress, spent money I didn't really have to spend, because for once I wanted to feel good walking into a room. I remember doing my hair that morning and thinking maybe tonight I'll feel like myself again. I overheard him in the kitchen talking to his cousin. He didn't know I was in the hallway getting my coat. He said, "She's a great girl. I don't know. I think I need someone who's more put together, someone who takes care of herself. It's exhausting always being the one who has it together in the relationship." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I sat with it for months. Someone who's more put together. I stood in that hallway in a dress I'd been proud of 20 minutes earlier, and I felt every ounce of confidence drain straight out through the floor. I want to describe the actual breakup conversation, because I think it matters for understanding the specific flavor of grief I was working through. It happened on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the engagement party. Daniel sat me down at our kitchen table, the same table where 4 years earlier he'd made me breakfast the morning after our first date, and said he'd been thinking a lot, that he cared about me deeply, but that he didn't think we wanted the same things anymore. I asked him what that meant, specifically. He struggled to answer directly, the way people often do when the truth is less noble than the language they're using to avoid it. Eventually, pressed, he admitted he'd overheard, no, he corrected himself, he'd said some things at his cousin's party that he stood by, even if he regretted the timing and the way I'd found out. He said he wanted a partner who prioritized her health and her ambitions the way she used to, and watching me settle over the past couple of years had been hard for him to witness. Watching me settle, as if I had settled alone, in a vacuum, with no context, no relationship dynamics, no slow erosion of 1,000 small permissions I'd granted him to shape who I was allowed to be. Here's what happened over the following 3 weeks. He ended things, not with cruelty, with the calm, rehearsed detachment of a man who'd clearly already emotionally left months before his mouth caught up. He used the word downgraded once in a fight when I asked him point blank if there was someone else. He said, "There's no one else. I just don't want to keep dating a downgraded version of the person I fell in love with." Downgraded. Not different, not struggling, downgraded, like I was a phone he was thinking about trading in.
I want to explain why that particular word did so much damage, more than any other insult could have. It wasn't cruel in an explosive way. Daniel never raised his voice, never called me names, never did anything a stranger overhearing the argument would flag as obviously abusive. It was worse than that, in a way, because it was clinical, detached. The language of upgrades and downgrades belongs to consumer electronics, to software versions, to things designed to be replaced without sentiment the moment something better comes along. Hearing it applied to 4 years of shared life, to a body and a spirit he'd once claimed to love, did something specific to my sense of self that a more obviously cruel insult might not have. It didn't just hurt, it categorized me. It filed me away as an older model, and some deep, ancient part of my brain absorbed that categorization as though it were an objective fact about my worth, rather than one tired man's careless word choice in the middle of an argument he didn't want to be having. I looked up the word downgrade that night, actually, in a moment of raw, humiliating curiosity, as if a dictionary definition might somehow soften it or explain it away. It didn't. It just sat there on my phone screen in stark, matter-of-fact language, and I closed the app and cried until I fell asleep. I moved out of our shared apartment into a smaller one 3 weeks later. I remember sitting on the floor of that empty new place, surrounded by boxes, eating cold pad thai out of the container, and thinking, he's right. Look at me. Look at this life. He's right. I want to tell you about the day I actually moved out, because it's one of those memories that has stayed sharper than almost anything else from that period, the way trauma tends to preserve certain scenes in unnaturally high resolution while blurring everything around them. It was a Saturday in early spring. My father drove up with his truck to help me move boxes, and the two of us worked mostly in silence because we're never a family that talks much about feelings while we're doing something physical. We process side by side, hands busy, words optional. Around the 3rd trip down the stairs, he set down a box in the hallway, wiped his forehead, and said, without looking at me directly, "For what it's worth, I never thought you needed to change for that man." Then he picked the box back up and kept walking, like he hadn't just handed me something I'd end up thinking about for the rest of the year. My mother, when I called to tell her the relationship had ended, cried before I did, which surprised me because I'd always thought of her as the stoic one. She said through tears, "I kept my mouth shut for 4 years because I wanted you to be happy, and it wasn't my place. But baby, you used to light up a room, and somewhere in the last few years, I watched that light get smaller and smaller, and it broke my heart every single time. I didn't have the capacity to receive that fully in the moment. I was too raw, too freshly wounded, too busy trying to survive the week, but I filed it away. Mothers see things, even when they don't say them." Telling my friends was its own strange education in who had actually stayed close to me and who I'd let drift away in service of the relationship. Some people I expected to rally around me went quiet, having grown closer to Daniel than to me over the years without my fully noticing. Others, people I unintentionally neglected, like Priya, showed up immediately and without hesitation. which taught me an early, humbling lesson about how proximity and love aren't always the same thing, and how the people worth keeping are rarely the ones who were loudest in the good years. That was the lowest point, not the breakup itself, the agreeing with him. The night I looked around at my life and thought the cruelest thing he'd said about me might actually be true. I want to back up for a second, because I don't think you can understand how deeply that sentence cut without understanding how my life looked like 4 years earlier, before Daniel, before any of this. I was 25 when we met. I was, by most people's accounts, a lot of fun. I hosted game nights. I took a solo trip to Portugal the year before we started dating because a friend of mine backed out and I decided, on a whim, I'd rather go alone than not go at all. I painted, badly, enthusiastically, and gave my terrible paintings away as birthday presents because I liked the idea of my mediocre art hanging in other people's homes. I laughed loudly. I ordered dessert first sometimes just because I could. I tell you this not to build up a fairy tale version of who I used to be, but because I think it's important for you to understand that the woman Daniel described in that kitchen, the one who let herself go, the one who was exhausting to be with, she wasn't born that way. She was built, slowly, out of 4 years of small accommodations I made without ever noticing I was making them. It starts so quietly you don't clock it as loss. The first year, I skipped Portugal round 2 because he didn't love to travel and I didn't want to go without him. That felt reasonable. Compromise, I told myself. The second year, I stopped hosting game nights because he found them a little much. Too many people, too much noise for a Tuesday. That felt reasonable too. The third year, I put the paintbrushes in a closet because he made one offhand comment about how our apartment felt cluttered with canvases drying against the wall, and I didn't want to be the reason our home felt chaotic to him. By year 4, I looked up one day and realized I hadn't painted in 14 months, hadn't traveled anywhere without him in 3 years, and hadn't hosted a single gathering in our home since the second year of the relationship. I hadn't lost myself in one dramatic moment. I'd been given away in installments, and I'd handed over each installment willingly, telling myself it was love, telling myself it was maturity, telling myself that's just what serious relationships require. I also want to name the specific doubts other people voiced during those 4 years because they layered on top of Daniel's slow erosion and made the eventual hallway comment land even harder than it might have otherwise. A coworker once told me, half joking, that I was too intense for most guys, and I laughed along, but I carried it. An old roommate once said, offhand, that I'd calmed down a lot since college, meaning it as a compliment. And I remember feeling a strange, hollow pride at having successfully shrunk myself enough to be noticed for it. My own inner critic picked up every one of these comments and filed them away as evidence, building a quiet, cumulative case that the parts of me that took space, the loud laugh, the strong opinions, the ambition, the appetite, literal and otherwise, were liabilities I needed to manage, rather than qualities worth protecting. By the time Daniel said someone more put together, it didn't land as one man's opinion. It landed as the final confirmation of a verdict I'd already half believed for years, stitched together from a dozen smaller comments I'd absorbed without ever questioning where they came from or whether they were even true. So when he said someone more put together in that kitchen, some deep, exhausted part of me actually agreed with him, not because he was right about my worth, but because I had spent 4 years quietly disappearing at his request, and now he was frustrated with the woman he'd asked me to become. That's the cruelty nobody talks about in relationships like this. It's rarely one villain and one victim. It's often a slow, mutual erosion where one person keeps asking for a little less of you and you keep giving it, until there's a version of you left that neither of you actually likes. I want to be really clear about something, because I think this part matters more than almost anything else in this story.
For the first 2 months, I did not glow up. I did not start a morning routine. I did not start running at dawn with inspirational music playing in my head. I ate poorly. I canceled plans. I scrolled his social media at 1 a.m. like it was a part-time job. I was, by every metric, exactly the person he'd described. I called in sick to work twice during that stretch, not because I was sick, but because I couldn't face the idea of putting on real clothes and having a real conversation with a real person who might ask how I was doing. I remember one Saturday where I didn't leave my apartment at all, didn't open the blinds, ordered delivery 3 separate times, and told myself it was self-care. It wasn't. It was grief wearing self-care's clothing, and there's a difference even if it took me a long time to learn it. My mother called during that stretch, worried because I hadn't answered her texts in 4 days. When I finally picked up, she asked gently, "Are you eating?" And I burst into tears on the phone in a way that scared both of us. I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me, and she was right not to. I also want to tell you about the version of myself I'm least proud of during those 2 months, because I think leaving it out would make this story dishonest, and dishonest glow-up stories don't help anyone. I texted Daniel twice, late at night, after wine, asking if we could talk. Both times, he responded kindly but firmly. He wasn't interested in getting back together. Both times, I hated myself a little more for reaching out. Not because wanting to reach out was shameful.
Grief makes all of us reach for the thing that hurt us sometimes, but because each time confirmed the same quiet fear that maybe he really had seen something true about me that I couldn't unsee myself. I remember standing in the shower one of those mornings, the water long gone cold because I'd lost track of time just standing there, and thinking with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, I don't recognize this person. I don't even like her very much. That thought should have been devastating, and it was for a moment. But it was also, I realize now, the first crack of light, because you cannot want to become someone new until you're honest enough to admit you don't like who you currently are. Comfort keeps you stuck. Honesty, even brutal, unflattering honesty, is what finally moves you. But somewhere in that ugly, unfilmed stretch of time, something small started to shift, and it didn't start with a decision to prove him wrong. It started with a sentence my grandmother said to me on the phone, almost as an afterthought, that I didn't even register as important until months later. She said, "Baby, a man will tell you who he is and who he needs, but only you get to decide who you are." I want to tell you a little more about my grandmother, because that single sentence didn't come from nowhere. It came from a woman who had lived her own version of this story decades ago, in a very different era, with far fewer resources and far less permission to talk about any of it openly. She'd raised 4 children largely alone after my grandfather left, rebuilt a small tailoring business from her kitchen table, and never once in my entire childhood spoke a bitter word about him in front of us. I used to think that silence meant she'd simply moved on effortlessly, the way children often flatten their elders' histories into simpler stories than the truth. It was only on that phone call, prompted by my own low, flat voice describing the breakup, that she told me more of the real story, how long it had actually taken her, how many nights she'd sat exactly where I was sitting, wondering if the version of her that a man had rejected was the true, correct version after all. It took me almost 3 years to stop agreeing with him, she told me. You don't have to take 3 years, but you don't have to rush it either. Just don't spend the whole time believing him instead of yourself. I hung up the phone that night, and I didn't feel inspired. I felt exhausted. But I wrote that sentence on a sticky note and put it on my bathroom mirror, mostly because I didn't have the energy to do anything else with it. That sticky note sat there for 6 weeks before anything changed. And that's when everything started to change. I want to tell you about the exact morning it shifted, because I remember it with a clarity that surprises me even now. It was a Sunday. I was 30 pounds heavier than I'd been the year we started dating, though I didn't know the exact number yet.
I hadn't weighed myself in months because I was afraid of the answer. I was hungover from a bottle of wine I'd drunk alone the night before while looking at pictures of Daniel and his new girlfriend who he'd started dating within 2 months of leaving me. Blonde, athletic, a marathon runner, according to her bio. I remember standing in my bathroom looking at that sticky note. A man will tell you who he is and who he needs, but only you get to decide who you are. And something in me just clicked. Not a lightning bolt, not a movie moment, just a quiet, tired click, like a key finally finding the right lock after trying a dozen wrong ones. I didn't think, I'll show him. I thought, I'm so tired of being someone I don't recognize. That's the distinction I need you to hold on to through this entire story, because it's the difference between a glow-up that lasts and one that collapses the second the anger runs out. I didn't start changing to punish Daniel. I started changing because I was disgusted with how small I'd let myself become, and I finally had enough grief in me to be honest about it. I want to describe that bathroom in detail because I think about it often now. It was small, the tile a little dated, a water stain on the ceiling I'd been meaning to ask the landlord about for months. The mirror was fogged from the shower I hadn't taken yet. The sticky note, yellow, curling slightly at one corner from humidity, sat there in my grandmother's borrowed wisdom, and underneath it, almost as an accident of geography, was my own reflection. Puffy-eyed, pale, wearing an old college t-shirt I'd slept in for 4 nights straight. I didn't cry. That surprised me, actually. I expected to cry. Instead, I felt something closer to resolve. Quiet, unglamorous resolve, the kind that doesn't make for a good movie scene, because it looks, from the outside, like almost nothing happening at all. I went to the kitchen. I filled a glass of water, not sparkling, not infused with lemon like the wellness influencers I'd start following months later, just tap water in a chipped mug because I didn't own a clean glass, and I drank the whole thing standing at the counter. Then I walked back to the bedroom and made the bed, pulling the comforter up over sheets that hadn't been washed in 3 weeks, tucking the corners the way my grandmother had taught me as a kid. Then I sat down with the free notebook I'd gotten at a work conference 2 years ago, the one I'd never used because Daniel used to tease me gently about my self-help phase whenever I bought books like Atomic Habits or The Gifts of Imperfection. I opened to the first
blank page, and I wrote the sentence that would become the quiet engine of the next 18 months of my life. I want to not recognize the woman who agreed with him. I looked at it for a long time. Then, underneath it, I wrote something smaller, almost embarrassed to admit even to myself. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to start today. That was the entire ceremony. No fireworks, no dramatic music, except maybe in my head, faint and unconvincing. Just a glass of water, a made bed, and 11 words in a notebook I almost threw away twice during the following winter because I felt so far from the woman I'd promised myself I'd become. That Sunday, I did 3 things. Small things, nothing photogenic. I drank a full glass of water, I made my bed, and I wrote down one thing, just one, that I wanted to be true about my life in a year. I wrote, I want to not recognize the woman who agreed with him. That was it. That was the whole revolution. 1 glass of water, 1 made bed, 1 sentence in a notebook I almost threw away twice during the following winter because I felt so far from the woman I'd promised myself I'd become. That Sunday, I did 3 things. Small things, nothing photogenic. I drank a full glass of water, I made my bed, and I wrote down one thing, just one, that I wanted to be true about my life in a year. I wrote, I want to not recognize the woman who agreed with him. That was it. That was the whole revolution.
1 glass of water, 1 made bed, 1 sentence in a notebook I almost threw away twice during the following winter because I felt so far from the woman I'd promised myself I'd become. That first month, I didn't lose a single pound. I signed up for a gym membership and went twice, then didn't go again for 11 days. I told myself I'd failed. I almost quit twice in the first 6 weeks alone. But I'd made a promise to myself. Not a big, dramatic promise, just a small, stubborn one, that I would not let one bad day become a bad month again. So on day 12, I went back. Not because I felt motivated, I didn't. I went because motivation is a liar that shows up late and leaves early, and I'd decided to build something sturdier. Discipline that didn't ask my feelings for permission. Month 2, I started walking every morning before work, just 20 minutes. I listened to podcasts about people who'd rebuilt their lives from nothing, not because I wanted to copy them, but because I needed proof it was possible for ordinary people, not just the superhuman ones. Month 3, I finally weighed myself. The number was worse than I expected, and for one night, that almost broke me. I cried on my bathroom floor. But then I did something I'm genuinely
Proud of. Looking back, I didn't spiral. I wrote the number down, and underneath it, I wrote, "This is a starting line, not a verdict." Before I get to the plateaus, I need to tell you about the week in month 4 that came closest to derailing everything, because I think stories like this owe their audience the ugly middle, not just the tidy arc. It was the week Daniel's new relationship became Instagram official. I found out the way you find out everything you wish you hadn't. A mutual friend liked a photo. It showed up in my feed, and there he was, arm around a smiling blonde woman at some rooftop bar, captioned with a single red heart. I remember staring at that photo for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 10 minutes, my chest tight in a way I hadn't felt since the actual breakup. That night, I skipped my walk, I skipped dinner, and then later ate an entire pint of ice cream standing over the kitchen sink at 11 p.m., crying in a way that felt like it was draining something ancient out of me, not just about Daniel, but about every time in my life I'd felt replaceable, unchosen, not enough. I texted Priya just one word, bad, and she called me within 90 seconds, no questions asked, and stayed on the phone with me until I fell asleep, exhausted, phone still pressed to my ear. The next morning, I almost didn't get up for my walk. I lay in bed for 40 extra minutes, genuinely questioning whether any of the last 4 months had meant anything, whether I was fooling myself into thinking a glass of water and a made bed could undo 4 years of quiet disappearing. But I got up. Not triumphantly, grudgingly, resentfully, the way you do something you've promised yourself you'd do even on the days you hate the promise. I walked 12 minutes instead of 20, and that was enough. That was the whole victory that day. Not the distance, just the not quitting. I tell you this because I think the myth of the glow-up is that motivation builds steadily, that each good day makes the next one easier. It doesn't work like that. It's not linear. It's a spiral, sometimes moving forward, sometimes circling back through old pain. And the only thing that actually determines whether you come out the other side is whether you keep showing up on the circling back days, too. I need to tell you about the plateaus because I think the plateaus are where most people quit and where I nearly quit too, more than once. There was a stretch in month 5, 6 full weeks, where the scale didn't move at all, despite doing everything right. I remember standing on it on a Wednesday morning, seeing the exact same number I'd seen 5 weeks earlier, and feeling a rage bubble up in me that surprised me with its intensity. Not rage at Daniel, rage at my own body, at the unfairness of effort not translating linearly into results, at the entire premise that discipline guarantees anything.
I texted Marisol, my nutrition coach, something close to, "What's the point? Nothing is working. I think my body is just broken." She called me instead of texting back. She said something I still think about. Your body isn't broken, it's recalibrating. Plateaus aren't punishment, they're proof your body is adjusting to a new normal before it lets you move to the next one. The scale is the least interesting data point you have. What does your energy feel like? What does your sleep feel like? What can your body do now that it couldn't do 3 months ago? That reframe mattered more than almost any workout I did that year, because when I actually sat with her questions, I realized I could climb the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment without stopping to catch my breath halfway up, something I hadn't been able to do in over a year. I was sleeping through the night for the first time since the breakup. My skin had changed. My mood, on the whole, had leveled out in a way that had nothing to do with a number on a scale. I kept going. 6 weeks after that plateau conversation, I dropped 4 pounds in a single week, and I understood, viscerally, what she meant. I also want to be honest about the setbacks that had nothing to do with weight. In month 4, I sprained my ankle badly on one of my morning walks, tripping on an uneven sidewalk while listening, ironically, to a podcast episode about resilience. I was in a boot for 6 weeks. I remember sitting on my couch, ankle elevated, feeling like the universe was actively conspiring against this fragile new version of discipline I was trying to build. But instead of stopping entirely, I adapted. I did seated stretching routines I found on YouTube. I focused that 6 weeks almost entirely on my UX certificate coursework instead, since my body needed rest, but my mind didn't. Looking back, that forced pause taught me something I didn't expect, that a glow-up isn't one relentless linear climb, it's more like a garden. Some seasons you're planting, some seasons you're just protecting what already grew, waiting for the ground to be ready again. I remember one particular evening during that boot-wearing stretch, sitting on my couch with my leg propped on 2 pillows, watching Priya's Instagram story of her own morning run, and feeling a flash of the old comparison-driven despair. Everyone else is moving forward, I'm stuck. I texted her something self-pitying, and she called me immediately, not to comfort me exactly, but to redirect me. You're not stuck, you're literally, medically required to rest right now. Resting on doctor's orders isn't the same thing as quitting. Stop treating your body like it owes you a debt for being injured. That reframe helped more than I expected. I started using the 6 weeks differently, not as a punishment to endure, but as a legitimate, useful season with its own purpose. I finished 2 full modules of my UX certificate during that stretch, propped up on the couch, laptop balanced on a pillow. I read 4 books I'd been meaning to get to for over a year. I called my grandmother twice, long, unhurried conversations I wouldn't have made time for if I'd still been running every day. Morning. When the boot finally came off, I cried a little, both from relief and from an odd, unexpected gratitude for what those 6 sidelined weeks had actually given me. I want to talk about the support system I built, because none of this happened in isolation, no matter how silent this glow-up looks from the outside. I reconnected with my college roommate, Priya, who I'd drifted from during the relationship because Daniel found her too much. Turns out, too much was code for too honest. Priya became the person I called crying at 11 p.m. and the person who showed up with a spare key when I needed my apartment cleaned because I couldn't face it myself. I found a nutrition coach, not a fad diet, not a quick fix, but a woman named Marisol who specialized in helping people rebuild their relationship with food after emotional eating patterns. I want to be specific here because specifics matter. Over the next 14 months working with her, I lost 62 pounds, slowly, unglamorously, with plateaus that lasted 6 and 7 weeks at a time where I wanted to quit. I started therapy for the first time in my life. My therapist, Dr. O'Coffer, said something in our 3rd session that rearranged something permanently in my brain. She said, "You keep describing your ex's opinion of you like it's a fact. It's not a fact, it's a data point about him." I want to spend a little more time on Priya because friendship doesn't get enough credit in stories like this one. We tend to make the glow up look like a solo mission, and mine absolutely wasn't. Priya and I had been inseparable in college. We'd lived together for 2 years, cried over bad grades, dated men who overlapped in exactly the wrong ways, and built the kind of shorthand friendship where a single look across a room says an entire paragraph. When I started dating Daniel, the visits got shorter, the calls got less frequent. By year 3 of the relationship, we were down to a birthday text and a "we should really catch up soon" that neither of us ever followed through on. I called her on a Tuesday night 4 months after the breakup, more out of desperation than confidence. I said, almost apologetically, "I know it's been forever, I'm sorry, I don't really have anyone else to call right now." She didn't hesitate. She said, "I've been waiting for this call for 3 years, tell me everything." We talked for 2 hours that night. She didn't say, "I told you so" about Daniel, even though, as it turned out, she'd had reservations about him from the beginning that she'd kept to herself out of respect for our relationship. Instead, she just listened. And then, at the end of the call, she said something that became a cornerstone of the following year. "I'm going to check in on you every single Sunday morning until you tell me to stop."
She never missed a Sunday, not once in 18 months. Some Sundays we talked for 3 hours. Some Sundays it was a 5-minute call where I just said, "I'm okay, tired, but okay," and that was enough. But the consistency of it, the sheer stubborn reliability of someone showing up for me on a schedule, week after week, regardless of how I was doing, rebuilt something in me that Daniel's slow withdrawal had worn down. It taught me again what it felt like to be chosen without having to shrink myself to earn it. I also want to tell you that the friendship wasn't one-directional because I think it's important not to paint myself as the only one healing in this story. In month 9, Priya went through a difficult stretch of her own, a job loss she hadn't seen coming, a blow to her confidence that mirrored, in its own way, what I'd walked through the year before. I remember getting the call and without hesitation showing up at her apartment with soup and a bottle of wine, sitting on her couch until 1 a.m. while she cried about feeling like a failure at 30. I told her something that night I hadn't fully realized I believed until I heard myself say it out loud. "A year ago, you rebuilt me on Sunday phone calls. Let me be your Sunday phone call for as long as you need." And I was, for 4 months. Until she landed a new role she loved even more than the old one, I checked in with the same stubborn consistency she'd shown me. That reciprocity mattered more than I expected. It reminded me that the whole point of rebuilding myself hadn't been to become impressively self-sufficient, needing no one. It had been to become someone capable of showing up fully for the people who mattered, instead of disappearing into a relationship that only had room for one person's needs at a time. I found Marisol, my nutrition coach, through a recommendation from a coworker who'd worked with her after her own difficult year. My first session with Marisol, I cried within the first 10 minutes, not about food at all, but about the engagement party, about the word downgrade, about how ashamed I felt even asking for help with something as basic as eating well. She said something I've repeated to myself probably 1,000 times since. "You're not here because you did something wrong. You're here because you're finally ready to do something right, for you, on purpose." Over 14 months working with her, I lost 62 pounds, slowly, unglamorously, with the plateaus I already told you about, and with a handful of weeks where I gained a pound or 2 back and had to fight the old instinct to spiral into all or nothing thinking. I want to tell you about one specific session with Marisol in month 3 that reshaped how I thought about food for the rest of the year. I confessed to her, shamefaced, that I'd eaten an entire bag of chips standing at my counter after a hard day, and I braced myself for some kind of correction, the way Daniel's raised eyebrow used to function as an unspoken correction. Instead, Marisol asked, "What was going on right before you opened the bag?" I told her about a brutal work call, about feeling talked over, about the familiar old shrinking feeling creeping back in. She nodded and said, "That's not a food problem. That's a feelings problem that food showed up to help with, because food is fast and available and doesn't ask you to be vulnerable with another person. The goal isn't to never eat the chips. The goal is to eventually have 5 other tools you reach for first, so the chips become a genuine choice instead of the only option your nervous system knows." Over the following months, we built that toolkit together. A 2-minute breathing exercise, a habit of calling Priya before opening the pantry on hard nights, a running list of 5-minute resets that had nothing to do with food at all. The chips didn't disappear from my life. I still ate them sometimes, guilt-free, on genuinely relaxed evenings. But the desperate, feelings-driven versions of that habit slowly thinned out, replaced by other tools that actually addressed what was underneath. Marisol taught me to see food differently, not as a punishment or a reward, but as fuel for a life I was actively building. She taught me to cook 3 meals I could make with my eyes closed on exhausted weeknights, and to stop treating a difficult day as permission to abandon everything I'd built. I started therapy for the first time in my life around month 2 with a woman named Dr. Okafor, who I found through my insurance's provider directory, honestly almost at random, and who turned out to be one of the most important people in this entire story. My therapist, Dr. Okafor, said something in our 3rd session that rearranged something permanently in my brain. She said, "You keep describing your ex's opinion like it's a fact. It's not a fact. It's a data point about him." I sat with that phrase, a data point about him, for weeks afterward. It became a kind of internal filter. Whenever an old, cruel thought crept back in, "You're too much, you're not put together, you're a downgrade," I learned to ask myself, is this a fact about me or a data point about the limited capacity of one particular man at one particular moment in his life to appreciate a person who no longer fit the shape he wanted? 9 times out of 10, it was the latter. I want to share one more small but important detail about how that filter worked in practice, because I think abstract advice like separate fact from opinion only helps once you see it applied to something concrete. A few months after that session, I was passed over for a project lead role at work in favor of a colleague with more formal design education. My old instinct screamed that this was proof I really was behind, really was an imposter who'd talked her way into a career she wasn't built for. I sat with that thought using Dr. Okafor's filter. Was this a fact about me, or a data point about one hiring decision made by one manager based on one specific set of criteria at one specific moment in time? Framed that way, it lost most of its power. It became simply information. Even useful, actually, since it told me exactly what skill gap to close next, rather than a verdict on who I fundamentally was. I want to share one more exchange from therapy, from around month 7, because it changed the way I understood the entire relationship, not just the ending of it. Dr. Okafor asked me to describe, in detail, the last time before Daniel that I remembered feeling completely, unapologetically myself. I had to think for a long time. Eventually, I landed on a memory from college, hosting a chaotic, loud Friendsgiving in my tiny dorm room. 11 people crammed onto 2 twin beds, burnt rolls, someone's off-key guitar playing, me laughing so hard I nearly knocked over a pot of gravy. "What happened to that version of you?" she asked. I said, honestly, I think I decided she was too much for a serious adult relationship. I think I traded her in, piece by piece, for someone I thought was more lovable. Dr. Okafor let that sit in the room for a moment before she said, "And how's that trade working out for you now?" It wasn't a rhetorical gotcha. She asked it gently, genuinely curious. And I remember answering slowly, working it out in real time. I think I'm trying to untrade her. I think that's what all of this has actually been. That session became a kind of compass for the rest of the year. Every habit, every hard morning walk, every rejected job application, every awkward introduction at the UX meetup, I started measuring it against a simple question. Does this bring me closer to the woman who hosted Friendsgiving with burnt rolls and no shame, or further from her? It turned out almost everything Daniel had asked me to shrink over 4 years was, without exception, some piece of that original, unashamed self. I also want to tell you about the habits, because this is the part people always ask about in the comments on videos like this. I woke up at 5:45 a.m., not because mornings are magic, but because it was the only time of day that was entirely, uncontestedly mine. I read for 20 minutes, I moved my body, I drank water before coffee. I started journaling 3 lines a night. One thing I was proud of, one thing that was hard, one thing I was looking forward to. I enrolled in a UX design certificate program online, something I'd wanted to do for years, but never pursued because Daniel called it a nice hobby, not a real career move. I studied for 2 hours most nights after work, exhausted, eyes burning, wondering constantly if I was too old, too behind, too far gone to build something new. I remember the first module vividly because it was almost entirely theory, color psychology, accessibility standards, the history of interface design, and I hated it for the first 2 weeks. I nearly refunded the course. What kept me going wasn't excitement, it was that same stubborn. I texted Marisol, my nutrition coach, something close to, "What's the point? Nothing is working. I think my body is just broken." She called me instead of texting back. She said something I still think about. Your body isn't broken, it's recalibrating. Plateaus aren't punishment, they're proof your body is adjusting to a new normal before it lets you move to the next one. The scale is the least interesting data point you have. What does your energy feel like? What does your sleep feel like? What can your body do now that it couldn't do 3 months ago? That reframe mattered more than almost any workout I did that year, because when I actually sat with her questions, I realized I could climb the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment without stopping to catch my breath halfway up, something I hadn't been able to do in over a year. I was sleeping through the night for the first time since the breakup. My skin had changed. My mood on the whole had leveled out in a way that had nothing to do with a number on a scale. I kept going. 6 weeks after that plateau conversation, I dropped 4 pounds in a single week, and I understood, viscerally, what she meant. I also want to be honest about the setbacks that had nothing to do with weight. In month 4, I sprained my ankle badly on one of my morning walks, tripping on an uneven sidewalk while listening, ironically, to a podcast episode about resilience. I was in a boot for 6 weeks. I remember sitting on my couch, ankle elevated, feeling like the universe was actively conspiring against this fragile new version of discipline I was trying to build. But instead of stopping entirely, I adapted. I did seated stretching routines I found on YouTube. I focused that 6 weeks almost entirely on my UX certificate coursework instead, since my body needed rest but my mind didn't. Looking back, that forced pause taught me something I didn't expect, that a glow-up isn't one relentless linear climb. It's more like a garden. Some seasons you're planting, some seasons you're just protecting what already grew, waiting for the ground to be ready again. I remember one particular evening during that boot-wearing stretch, sitting on my couch with my leg propped on 2 pillows, watching Priya's Instagram story of her own morning run, and feeling a flash of the old comparison-driven despair. Everyone else is moving forward, I am stuck. I texted her something self-pitying, and she called me immediately, not to comfort me exactly, but to redirect me. You're not stuck, you're literally medically required to rest right now. Resting on doctor's orders isn't the same thing as quitting. Stop treating your body like it owes you a debt for being injured. That reframe helped more than I expected. I started using the 6 weeks differently, not as a punishment to endure, but as a legitimate, useful season with its own purpose. I finished 2 full modules of my UX certificate during that stretch, propped up on the couch, laptop balanced on a pillow. I read 4 books I'd been meaning to get to for over a year. I called my grandmother twice, long, unhurried conversations I wouldn't have made time for if I'd still been running every day.
I kept a small note in my phone titled Evidence, where I logged tiny proofs that I was becoming someone new. The day I said no to a work request that would have eaten my weekend. The day I cooked a meal from scratch instead of ordering out of habit rather than hunger. The day I caught myself mid-sentence about to apologize for having an opinion in a meeting and stopped myself and just didn't apologize. By month 6, that note had over 40 entries. Reading back through it on hard days became its own kind of medicine. And that's when everything started to change. I have to talk about how I processed the original hurt, because moving on isn't a switch you flip. It's a debt you pay down slowly, in small installments, over a long time. Some nights, the anger came back sharp and sudden, usually triggered by something small, like seeing a couple who reminded me of what we used to be, or hearing a song that had played in his car. I let myself feel it. Dr. Okafor taught me that suppressing it just delays it, and delayed grief compounds interest. So I cried when I needed to. I wrote furious, unfiltered pages in my journal that I later burned in the kitchen sink just to physically release something I couldn't say out loud. But I also started separating two things that had gotten tangled together in my head: the pain of the breakup and the shame of not being enough. The breakup was an event. It happened, it hurt, it was real. But the shame, the belief that I deserved to be downgraded, that wasn't truth. That was a story I'd absorbed from one man's momentary cruelty, and I slowly, deliberately started rewriting it. There's one more piece of the processing I want to share, because I think it's the piece people skip most often in these stories, and it's the piece that made the biggest difference for me personally. Around month 5, Dr. Okafor asked me to write a letter to Daniel that I would never send. Not a letter forgiving him, not a letter attacking him, just an honest letter, saying everything I'd never let myself say out loud, including the parts that weren't flattering to me. I resisted the exercise for 2 weeks. It felt silly, performative, like something out of a self-help book I would have rolled my eyes at a year earlier. I finally sat down and wrote it on a rainy Sunday afternoon, and it came out in a single, unedited rush, 4 pages, longhand, my handwriting getting messier as I went. I told him about the hallway, about how that sentence had lived in my body for months. I told him about the 4 years of quiet accommodations, the paintings in the closet, the Portugal trip I never took a second time. But I also wrote something I hadn't expected to write, an acknowledgement that I had let it happen, that I had handed pieces of myself over without ever being asked to, and that some of the anger I'd been directing at him actually belonged, in part, to myself, the version of
Me who'd stopped fighting for her own space in that relationship long before he ever said the word downgrade. I cried through most of it. At the end, I wrote one final line. I hope you find whatever put together looks like to you. I'm going to go find out what it looks like for me. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, wrote his name on the front out of some strange ceremonial instinct, and then burned it in my kitchen sink the way I'd burned other angry pages before. Watching the paper curl and blacken, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. Not everything, not all at once, but something. That letter didn't fix anything by itself. Grief doesn't work in single grand gestures, no matter how cinematic they feel in the moment. But it was one more small stone removed from the pile I'd been carrying, and by month 6, the pile had gotten noticeably, tangibly lighter. By month 6, I had lost 22 pounds. I had finished the first module of my UX certificate. I had a Sunday morning ritual with Priya that neither of us missed. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't flinch. I wasn't glowing yet, not the way this story ends, but I was, for the first time in years, present in my own life. That was the decision. Not a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 small returns to the same quiet promise. I want to not recognize the woman who agreed with him. She was starting to disappear. Someone else was starting to take her place. By month 9, things were different in ways I could measure and ways I couldn't. I want to start with a specific moment that I think of as the first real sign, the first outside confirmation that something had genuinely shifted, not just internally, but in how the world was starting to respond to me. It happened in month 8, before the promotion, before the half marathon, before any of the bigger milestones. Renata pulled me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon and said she wanted me to shadow a senior designer on a pitch for a well-known regional retailer, a much bigger account than anything I'd touched in my first several months at the agency. "Why me?" I asked, old reflexes kicking in, already halfway to explaining why I probably wasn't ready. She looked at me, genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because you're the only person on this floor who asks why in every single client meeting, instead of just nodding along. That's rarer than you think. I want that instinct on this pitch."
I sat in my car in the parking garage after that conversation and cried, not from sadness, but from the strange, disorienting shock of being seen accurately for the first time in years. Daniel had spent the tail end of our relationship suggesting, in 100 small ways, that my questions were exhausting, that my curiosity was a lot. Renata had just told me that exact same quality was the reason she trusted me with a bigger opportunity. It was the same woman, the same brain, the same instinct, just finally standing in a room that valued it instead of asking her to file it down. The measurable ones first, because I know you want the numbers. I had lost 41 pounds. I had finished my UX certificate with a portfolio I was genuinely proud of. 3 case studies I'd built from scratch, redesigning apps I used every day, and documenting my process like a real designer, because Marisol had once told me, "Fake it till you make it doesn't work. Practice it till you make it does." Before the applications even started, there was a whole invisible season of networking I want to tell you about, because it was some of the least glamorous work of the entire year. I joined a local UX meetup group that convened monthly in the back room of a bar downtown, and I remember walking into my first one alone, knowing absolutely no one, clutching a poorly designed business card I'd made myself the night before at my kitchen table. I introduced myself to 3 strangers that first night, forcing the words out past a throat tight with old social anxiety, the residue of years spent shrinking in rooms so as not to be too much. I kept going to that meetup every month for almost a year. By month 6 of attending, I wasn't the anxious newcomer anymore. I was someone people recognized, someone who occasionally helped run the beginner critique sessions, someone who'd built an actual professional network from a folding chair in the back of a dive bar. 2 of the 11 job applications I eventually sent came directly from connections made in that room. I applied for 11 junior UX positions and got rejected by 9 of them. I want to say that number out loud because glow-up stories skip the rejections, and the rejections were where the real growth happened. Each no used to flatten me for days. By the 9th one, I read the email, felt the sting for about an hour, and then opened my laptop and kept revising my portfolio anyway. The 10th application got me an interview. The 11th got me an offer. I want to tell you about that interview because it's one of my favorite memories from this entire year and a half. It was a video call with the creative director of a small agency, a woman named Renata, who asked me pointedly, "You've only got a certificate and a portfolio, no formal design job history. Why should I take a chance on you?" A year earlier, that question would have flattened me. I would have apologized my way through an answer, hedged every sentence, made myself smaller to preempt her rejection. Instead, I heard myself say, calmly, "Because I finished a 14-week certificate program while working full-time."
built 3 original case studies from scratch with real user research, and I've spent the last 9 months proving to myself repeatedly that I follow through on things even when they're hard and nobody's watching. That's not on a resume, but it's exactly the kind of person you want on a small team. She hired me 2 days later. She told me afterward that answer was the moment she decided. I left my stable, soul-numbing job, the one I'd taken because Daniel liked the security of it, and I took an entry-level UX role at a small design agency for less money than I'd been making before. My mother thought I was insane. "You're 30 years old, starting over?" she said. And I remember telling her calmly, for maybe the first time in my adult life, "I'm not starting over. I'm starting right." The first 3 months at the agency were humbling in a good way. I was the oldest person on the junior design team by 4 years, working alongside 24-year-olds who'd studied design formally and moved through software with a fluency I was still building. There were days I went home and cried from sheer mental exhaustion, feeling like an imposter in a role I'd fought a year to earn. But I kept showing up, kept asking questions I was embarrassed to ask, kept staying 20 minutes late most nights to practice skills on my own time. By month 3 at the job, my creative director gave me my first solo client project, a nonprofit's donation page redesign. And when the client's conversion rate went up 31% after launch, Renata put a sticky note on my monitor that just said, "Told you so." I kept that sticky note. It's still on my desk. I want to tell you about a hard moment at the agency too, in month 11, because the growth wasn't a straight line there either. I led my first major client pitch, a full app redesign for a regional healthcare startup, and it went badly. Not catastrophically, but badly enough that the client chose a competing agency, and Renata had to deliver that news to the team in a meeting, where I sat there feeling the old shame creep back up my spine, the voice that used to say, "You're not put together enough for this," whispering that maybe I'd overreached taking this career leap at 30. I went home that night and for the first time in months felt genuinely tempted to shrink back into old patterns, to downplay my ambitions, to stop reaching for stretch projects, to protect myself from future failure by simply wanting less. I called Priya, and she listened, and then she asked me a question that reframed the entire evening. "Did you do your actual best work on that pitch, or did you hold back?" I thought about it honestly. I held back, I admitted. I was scared to push the boldest ideas because I was worried they'd think I was inexperienced. Then the lesson isn't want less. It's trust yourself more next time.
She was right, and it recalibrated something important in me. Failure, it turned out, wasn't proof that I'd overreached. It was information about where I was still playing it safe. I applied that lesson 3 months later on a different pitch, brought my boldest ideas forward without hedging them, and won the account. That failure in month 11 was, in hindsight, a necessary rung on the ladder, not a sign I didn't belong on it. But I want to talk about the invisible changes, because those mattered more than any number on a scale or any line on a resume. I stopped shrinking in rooms. I noticed it first at a work happy hour. A coworker asked my opinion on a project, and I gave it, clearly, without the apologetic preamble I used to attach to every sentence. This might be dumb, but I could be wrong, but I just said what I thought. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 4 years. I started noticing men who were kind in ways Daniel hadn't been. Not because I was looking for a replacement, but because my radar for kindness had recalibrated. I went on a few dates during this period, and I remember one man asking me, genuinely curious, what I was passionate about, and I nearly cried in the middle of a coffee shop because it had been so long since anyone asked. I want to describe one particular date in month 9 because it taught me something important about how much my baseline expectations had shifted without my fully noticing. His name was Marcus, a friend of a coworker, and about 20 minutes into dinner, he asked if I wanted to order dessert. I felt my body brace, instinctively, for some version of Daniel's old, "Are you sure?"
and instead, Marcus just said, "I'm getting the tiramisu, you want to split it or get your own?" No scrutiny, no implied commentary, just a normal, uncomplicated question about cake. I remember excusing myself to the restroom halfway through that dinner, not because anything was wrong, but because I needed a private minute to process how disorienting it was to sit across from someone who simply wasn't grading me. I looked at myself in the restroom mirror and thought, with something between amusement and grief, this is what normal was supposed to feel like the whole time. I didn't date Marcus seriously. The spark just wasn't there, and I'd learned by then not to force compatibility just because someone was kind. But that dinner mattered enormously. It was proof, concrete and lived in, that my instincts, my sense of what I deserved in an ordinary Tuesday dinner conversation, were healing. I no longer needed a grand romantic gesture to know I was being treated well. I just needed someone who didn't make cake a referendum on my worth. I want to mention another invisible shift, one that surprised even me. Around month 9, I noticed I'd stopped narrating my life to an imaginary audience of Daniel. For most of the year, without fully realizing it, I'd been doing small things partly for him, imagining how he'd react if
he saw my new job, my new body, my new confidence. It's a common trap in glow-up stories, and I fell into it too, quietly for months. The shift happened on an ordinary Thursday. I finished a hard workout, sweaty and proud, and reached for my phone out of old habit to imagine, half-consciously, sharing the moment in a way that might eventually reach him. And then I caught myself, put the phone down, and just sat with the pride on its own terms. No imagined audience, no performance, just me. Alone in my apartment, proud of myself, for myself. That was a bigger turning point than any pound lost or promotion earned, honestly, because up until that point, some invisible, wounded part of me had still been building this new life partly as a rebuttal. That Thursday, it stopped being a rebuttal. It just became my life. Here's where the people who doubted me started to notice. My cousin, who'd once told my aunt at a family dinner that I let myself go after the breakup, was the first to comment on a photo I posted after finishing a half marathon, something I trained for over 4 months, something I would have called physically impossible for myself 2 years earlier. She wrote, "Wow, look at you," with 3 exclamation points, and I remember feeling a small private satisfaction that I chose not to dwell on, because dwelling on other people's approval was exactly the trap I'd spent a year climbing out of. A former coworker who'd been mutual friends with Daniel messaged me out of nowhere. "Heard you switched careers. That's such a bold move. Good for you." I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. Word travels in small circles, and apparently my name had started circulating in a different tone. The moment that meant the most, though, happened at a family gathering in month 10, my cousin's baby shower of all places. My aunt, the same one who'd repeated my cousin's "let herself go" comment at a dinner a year earlier, pulled me aside near the dessert table. She's not a woman prone to sentimentality, so what she said landed with extra weight. She said, "I want to apologize. I said some things after your breakup that I shouldn't have repeated, and I've watched you rebuild your whole life this year with more grace than I think I could have managed. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry." I hadn't expected an apology, hadn't even realized how much I'd been quietly carrying that particular comment until it was addressed directly. I told her I appreciated it, and I meant it, but I also noticed something interesting about my own reaction. The apology felt nice, but it didn't feel necessary anymore. A year earlier, an apology like that might have felt like water in a desert. By month 10, it felt more like a gentle kindness on solid ground I'd already built myself. That's an important distinction I want to highlight, because I think it's easy to mistake the goal of a glow-up as collecting apologies and validation from everyone who ever doubted you. The real goal, the one that actually sustains you, is reaching a point where those apologies are nice, but
No longer load-bearing, where your sense of worth doesn't depend on anyone else's reassessment of you. But I want to tell you about the internal shift, because it's the part of this story I'm proudest of, and it's the part that took the longest. Somewhere around month 10, I stopped checking Daniel's social media. Not because I forced myself to, I just genuinely forgot to. I realized this one Tuesday when I went to open the app out of old habit and realized I hadn't thought about doing it in nearly 3 weeks. I remember sitting with that realization on my couch, and instead of feeling triumphant, I felt something quieter and more important: relief. True relief. The kind that comes not from winning, but from finally putting something heavy down. Dr. O'Coffer asked me in one of our final sessions, if Daniel walked into this room right now and apologized sincerely for everything he said, how would you feel? I thought about it for a long time before answering, and the honest answer surprised me. I don't think I'd feel much of anything, I said. Not coldness, just distance. Like hearing an apology for something that happened to a different person. That's when I understood something that changed how I saw the entire year behind me. I hadn't built this new life to make Daniel regret losing me. I'd built it because somewhere in the wreckage of that hallway conversation at his cousin's engagement party, I'd finally gotten angry enough, not at him, but at myself, to stop settling for a life that fit someone else's comfort instead of my own becoming. I have to tell you about training for that half marathon because it became, in a strange way, the physical proof of everything I'd been building internally. I signed up on a whim in month 7, mostly because Priya had mentioned wanting to do one and asked if I'd train with her. I hadn't run more than a mile at a time since high school gym class. The training plan was 16 weeks. There were mornings in month 8 where I ran in freezing rain because the schedule said I had to. And I remember one particular 6-mile run where I stopped halfway, sat down on a curb, and genuinely considered quitting the whole plan. My knees hurt, my chest hurt. I thought about Daniel's voice, someone more put together. And for one bitter, exhausted second, I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I really can't do hard things. Then I stood back up. I finished the 6 miles. At a walk, but I finished them.
Race day. 4 months later, I crossed the finish line at 2 hours and 8 minutes, Priya beside me the entire way, both of us crying and laughing at the same time in that particular way that only shared physical suffering seems to produce. I called my mother from the finish corral, still shaking, and she cried too, and said, "I am so, so proud of you," in a voice I hadn't heard her use with me in years. By month 11, I had been promoted to mid-level designer. I want to tell you about the actual conversation where that happened because it stands out to me as one of the clearest markers of how much had changed internally, not just professionally. Renata called me into her office, and my first instinct, old, worn-in, automatic, was a flash of panic. Some leftover part of me still expecting bad news by default, still bracing for the version of feedback Daniel used to deliver dressed up as concern. Instead, she slid a piece of paper across the desk, a new title, a raise, and a note that read simply, "You've earned this, and you're going to keep earning bigger things. Stop being surprised every time someone recognizes it." I laughed, a little embarrassed at how visibly relieved I must have looked. She caught it, and she said something I've held on to since. "You flinch every time I call you in here. One day you're going to walk in here expecting good news as often as bad, because both are equally likely at this point. That's the actual glow-up, by the way, not the promotion, the flinch going away." She was right. It took another 4 months after that conversation before I stopped bracing entirely when summoned to her office, but I noticed the flinch getting smaller each time, until one ordinary Tuesday in month 15, she called me in to discuss a new client, and I realized, walking down the hallway, that I felt nothing but simple, uncomplicated curiosity. No bracing, no old panic, just curiosity. The way a normal, secure person walks into any ordinary meeting. I had run a half marathon in under 2 hours and 10 minutes. I had lost 58 pounds total, and more importantly, had stopped weighing myself every day because my worth had quietly detached itself from that number months earlier. I had rebuilt a friendship with Priya that felt like coming home. I had a small, steady circle of people who knew the real me, not the shrunken, apologetic version, but the one who spoke up in meetings, who took the pottery class back up on Thursday evenings, who laughed loudly in restaurants without checking to see if anyone minded. I want to tell you about one particular setback in month 8, because I think it's important context before we get to the encounter this story is building toward. I ran into a mutual friend of Daniel's and mine at a coffee shop, someone I hadn't seen since the breakup, who clearly hadn't gotten the memo about how much had changed. She did the thing people sometimes do without meaning harm. She looked me up and down, visibly startled,
and said, "Oh my God, you look incredible. What happened?" in a tone that implied something had been deeply wrong with me before. I smiled, said something polite and non-committal, and got my coffee. But I sat in my car afterward for a full 10 minutes before driving anywhere, feeling a familiar old sting resurface. The sense that my body, my worth, had always been up for public evaluation, that people felt entitled to comment on the before as casually as they complimented the after. It reminded me, uncomfortably, of Daniel's voice in that kitchen. I texted Dr. Okoffer's advice to myself as a note that night. Other people's shock at your growth is not an insult to who you were before. It's a reflection of how little they actually understood you then, and that's not your burden to carry. That distinction mattered. It let me hold on to compassion for the version of myself from a year earlier, heavier, sadder, still worthy, still whole, instead of internalizing other people's clumsy comments as confirmation that my old self had been somehow lesser. I also want to describe an ordinary Tuesday from around month 10, because I think ordinary days tell you more about a real transformation than highlight reel ones do. I woke at 5:45, the alarm no longer feeling like punishment, just routine. I read 15 pages of a novel with coffee. I walked 25 minutes before work, further than the original 20 I'd started with, past a bakery whose owner had started waving at me by name. At work, I presented a wireframe revision to a client on a call, my voice steady, no apologetic hedging in my sentences. That evening, I met Priya for our usual Thursday pottery class, where my hands, no longer new to the wheel, shaped something almost symmetrical for the first time. I went to bed at 10:30, journaled 3 lines, and fell asleep without a single thought of Daniel crossing my mind. Nothing about that day would make it into a highlight reel. No triumphant music, no dramatic reveal. But that boring, steady Tuesday is exactly what 18 months of quiet work actually produces. Not a single cinematic moment, but hundreds of unremarkable days where the new version of you simply becomes the only version of you. I want to pause here and tell you about the 1-year mark specifically, because I marked it deliberately, in a way I hadn't planned, but that ended up meaning a great deal to me. On the exact anniversary of the engagement party, the night in that hallway, I took myself out to dinner alone. Not out of loneliness, but as a kind of ceremony, a full circle marker I'd been quietly looking forward to for weeks. I wore the same color dress I'd worn that night a year earlier, though a completely different size, different fabric, different woman inside it. I ordered the dessert I wanted without a second thought. I brought my notebook, the one with the 11 words in it, and I read that page again for the first time in months. I want to not recognize the woman who agreed with him.
I sat with that sentence for a long time, tears coming quietly, not from sadness this time, but from something closer to awe, because I genuinely didn't recognize her anymore. Not her body, not her voice in meetings, not the way she moved through a room, not the thoughts that ran through her head at 5:45 in the morning. I'd done the thing, slowly, imperfectly, with plateaus and sprained ankles, and one devastating Instagram photo and a burned letter in a kitchen sink. But I'd done it. I ordered a second glass of wine that night, toasted quietly to no one but myself, and wrote one final line beneath the old sentence in the notebook. Found her. Keep going anyway. And that's when everything started to change. Not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because I finally had nothing left to prove, except to myself, every single morning, that I was going to keep choosing this life. And I did. I want to pause, right at this hinge point in the story, before we get to the party itself, and name something plainly. Everything you're about to hear in the next act only worked because of everything you just heard in this one. The calm I carried into that room wasn't a performance I put on for one night. It was the residue of 500 and some ordinary days, plateaus, sprained ankles, burnt letters, Sunday phone calls, chips eaten over a counter, a promotion earned twice over, a half marathon finished slowly in the rain. None of that was for him. All of it, without exception, is the reason his reaction, whatever it turned out to be, was never going to be able to touch me. 18 months after the breakup, I got invited to a mutual friend's dinner party. I almost didn't go. Old instinct, old fear of running into Daniel in a room where I hadn't controlled the terms of the encounter. I called Priya that afternoon, half looking for permission to skip it. "What if he's there?" I asked her, hating how small my voice sounded, hating that after everything, that old fear could still surface so quickly. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Would the version of you from 18 months ago have gone?" "No," I admitted. She would have stayed home and spiraled about what to wear if she ever ran into him, and then never actually tested it. "Then go," Priya said. "Not to prove anything, just because you actually want to see our friend's new apartment, and because hiding from a room because of a man who hasn't crossed your mind in weeks doesn't sound like the person you've become would do."
She was right, and I knew it the moment she said it. So I got dressed, not for him, I want to be clear, just in an outfit I liked, that I felt like myself in, and I went. The days leading up to that party, I noticed my own mind doing something interesting, almost against my will, running little imagined scenarios of what I'd say if I saw him, the way you rehearse a speech you hope you'll never have to give. I caught myself mid-shower one morning constructing an entire imaginary conversation complete with a witty, cutting closing line, and I laughed out loud at myself, alone, water running down my face. Old habits, apparently, take longer to fully dissolve than I'd assumed. Dr. Okafor, when I mentioned it in our next session, told me that was completely normal, that the nervous system doesn't always know the danger has passed just because the mind does, and that a little residual bracing before a potential encounter wasn't proof I hadn't healed, just proof I was still human. That reassurance mattered, because I think glow-up stories sometimes imply that real healing means feeling nothing at all ever about the person who hurt you, some flawless, permanent calm. That's not realistic, and it's not what happened to me. What happened was smaller and more honest. The bracing still occurred sometimes, but it no longer determined my behavior. I could feel a flicker of old nerves in the shower on a random Wednesday and still walk into that party 3 days later without hesitation. But then I thought about the woman I'd built over the last year and a half, and I thought, she doesn't hide from rooms anymore. I went. I got there a little late, having gone straight from a client meeting, still wearing my work clothes and the particular kind of tired satisfaction that comes from a good, productive day. The apartment was warm and loud, string lights strung across the balcony, a playlist I recognized from Priya's own parties, drifting out of a Bluetooth speaker. I hugged our mutual friend at the door, handed her the bottle of wine I'd brought, and made my way toward the kitchen, where I could hear Priya's laugh cutting through the noise. He was there. Of course he was there. It was his friend's dinner party, too, something I'd conveniently forgotten when I said yes. He saw me from across the room, and I watched his face do something I hadn't expected, a flicker of confusion, like his brain was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the memory he'd been carrying. I noticed him noticing me before I let myself look back.
There's a particular stillness that happens when someone across a room realizes they're looking at a person they used to know intimately and no longer recognize on sight. I saw his eyes move, quickly, almost involuntarily, from my face, down, and back up, the visual equivalent of a double take. I saw him set his drink down like he needed both hands free to process what he was looking at. I saw him say something to the person next to him, low, and I'd bet money it was some version of, "Is that?"
I want to describe the room a little more because I think the ordinary details matter. Our mutual friend's new apartment had exposed brick and mismatched vintage chairs, the kind of place that looks curated but is really just the product of years of thrift store trips. Priya found me within minutes of my arrival, handed me a glass of wine, and murmured, low enough for only me to hear, "He's by the window. He's already seen you, and he looks like he's forgotten how to use his face normally." We both laughed, quietly, conspiratorially, the way you laugh with someone who has watched every single stage of your rebuilding and gets to enjoy this moment almost as much as you do. I didn't rush the moment. I talked to our host for a while, admired her new kitchen, caught up with 2 other old friends I hadn't seen in months. I want to be honest that there was a small human part of me that noticed him noticing and felt a brief, warm satisfaction in it. I'm not going to pretend I was some enlightened being floating entirely above petty human feeling, but that satisfaction was small and passing, a flicker, not the main event. The main event was simply enjoying the party on its own terms, which is exactly what I did for the better part of an hour before he finally crossed the room. I want to describe this moment honestly, because I think the honesty is what makes it powerful, not exaggeration. I was not unrecognizable. I hadn't become a different species of person. I was simply fully present in my own body and my own life in a way I hadn't been in years. I was wearing a dress I'd bought for myself, with money from a job I'd built from nothing, on a body I'd rebuilt through 62 pounds of unglamorous mornings. I was laughing at something Priya said before he even crossed the room, and the laugh wasn't performed for him, it was just mine. He walked over eventually, after what I'd guess was a solid 15 minutes of what looked from across the kitchen like him working up the nerve. "Hey," he said. "Wow, you look really great." Here is the part I want you to really hear, because it's the whole point of this video. I felt nothing sharp. No triumph, no urge to say something cutting, no need to list my accomplishments like a receipt of everything he'd missed out on. I want to be honest. A year earlier, I had fantasized about this exact moment, had scripted cutting, clever things to say if I ever ran into him looking like this. Standing there in real life, none of those old scripts even occurred to me. They'd simply become irrelevant. The way a language you used to speak fluently gets rusty from disuse. I just said, "Thank you. How have you been?" Calm, warm even, because I genuinely didn't need anything from him anymore. Not an apology, not an admission, not a comeuppance. I'd already gotten the only thing that mattered, myself, back. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. Surface things, his job, mutual friends. I noticed with a strange, gentle curiosity that he seemed nervous, filling silences too quickly, complimenting,
Made twice more in ways that felt like fishing for something. He asked what I was doing for work now, and when I told him, UX designer, small agency, a client roster I was genuinely proud of, he actually stumbled over his response, saying, "Wait, seriously? Wow, that's a big shift. Good for you." With a tone I recognized instantly because I used to speak in that exact tone myself whenever I was trying to sound supportive of something that actually stung. He mentioned almost too casually that things with the marathon runner girlfriend hadn't worked out. He said it looking at me in a way that seemed to be waiting for a reaction, some flicker of satisfaction or opening. I gave him neither. I just nodded, the way you'd nod at any mildly interesting piece of news about someone you no longer had a stake in. Then he said the thing I think he'd been building up to the whole conversation. Honestly, I think about that time a lot. I said some things I shouldn't have said. You didn't deserve that. I appreciated it. I did. Apologies, even late ones, even ones that arrive after you've already stopped needing them, still mean something. I said, "Thank you for saying that. I hope you're doing well." And that was it. No further conversation about it. No opening for a "we should catch up sometime." I wasn't cold. I wasn't performing indifference for an audience. There wasn't one. Nobody at that party even knew this was happening. I was simply, genuinely, at peace. Here's what I realized standing in that kitchen, holding a glass of wine I'd chosen because I liked it, not because it was low calorie. This was never about him seeing me at my best. It never had been, even though a year and a half earlier, some wounded part of me had absolutely fantasized about a moment exactly like this one. The realization hit me clean and quiet, somewhere between his apology and my second sip of wine. I hadn't built this life for the 3 minutes it took him to notice it. I'd built it for the other 8,760 hours of every year, the ones he'd never see, the ones that were entirely, privately mine. He tried once, a few weeks later, to text me, something light, "We should get coffee sometime, catch up properly." I looked at the message for a long moment, feeling absolutely nothing urgent about it either way. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't respond with a cutting rejection engineered to hurt him. I simply didn't respond at all because I realized I didn't need to give him any more of my attention than the 10 polite minutes I'd already given at that dinner party. Some chapters don't need closing lines. They just need you to stop turning the page.
I thought about that text message on and off for a few days afterward. Not because I was tempted to respond, but because I was curious about my own reaction, or lack of one. A year and a half earlier, a text like that from Daniel would have sent me into a spiral of overanalysis, would have had me calling Priya to dissect every word, would have kept me up rereading it at midnight looking for hidden meaning. Instead, I read it once, felt a brief, mild flicker of something that wasn't quite anything, and went back to editing a wireframe I was working on for a client deadline. That, I think, is what healing actually feels like in practice. Not a dramatic absence of feeling, but an almost boring proportionality. A text from an ex-boyfriend registering as roughly as significant as a text from a dentist's office confirming an appointment. Not cold, just correctly sized. I told Dr. O'Coffer about the encounter and the text in our next session, and she asked me a question I've carried with me since. If he'd shown up at that party and been cruel again, dismissive or cutting the way he was near the end, do you think it would have undone any of the last 18 months? I thought about it honestly before answering. No, I said, and I meant it, because none of what I built was actually about him. It would have stung for an evening, maybe, but it wouldn't have touched the foundation. That's when I understood, fully, what this whole story had actually been about. Not the encounter, not his face when he saw me. Those things were satisfying, sure, in a small human way, I won't pretend otherwise, but they weren't the point. The point was that I had built something inside myself sturdy enough that his reaction, whatever it might have been, could no longer reach the parts of me that mattered. That was the whole encounter. Not a scene, not a scream, just a woman who used to shrink herself for a man's comfort, standing fully sized in a room, completely unbothered by his presence in it. That's the moment from the hook of this video, the one through the restaurant window, the one where I felt nothing and everything all at once. I told you at the start it wasn't dramatic. I meant it. The most powerful moment of my entire glow-up wasn't loud. It was quiet enough that if you'd been standing next to me, you might have missed it completely. I want to tell you what I did in the minutes right after that window moment, because I think it's the most honest ending I can give you. I didn't call anyone triumphantly to report it. I didn't post anything. I walked the rest of the way home, let myself into my apartment, put my keys in the bowl by the door, and started making tea, the same way I would have on any other unremarkable Tuesday. At some point, standing at my kitchen counter waiting for the kettle, I caught my own reflection in the dark window above the sink, and I just looked at myself for a moment. really looked, the way I used to avoid doing in the months right after the breakup, and I felt something settle in my chest, warm and quiet, that I can only describe as home, not because of him, not because of what he'd witnessed through that restaurant glass, just because for the first time in longer than I could remember, the woman looking back at me was someone I recognized, someone I liked, someone I'd actually chosen to become. They say the best revenge is living well. I used to think that meant living well at someone, flaunting it, making sure they saw, making sure it stung. I don't believe that anymore. The best revenge is living well, but only if you're doing it for yourself. Because if you build a whole new life just to make someone else jealous, you'll get to the finish line and realize you built a mansion with no one home inside it, just a monument to a person who probably isn't even thinking about you anymore. Build the life because you deserve to not recognize the version of yourself that agreed with someone else's worst opinion of you. If you're in your own lowest point right now, if someone said something to you that you can't stop replaying, if you've started agreeing with the cruelest thing anyone's ever said about you, I want you to hear this clearly. That sentence is not a fact. It's a data point about them, about their limitations, about what they were capable of seeing in that moment. It is not a verdict on who you are or who you're allowed to become. Start small. Smaller than you think you need to. A glass of water, a made bed, one sentence in a notebook about who you want to not recognize a year from now. Don't wait for motivation. It's a liar that shows up late and leaves early. Build something sturdier. Show up on the days you don't feel like it, especially those days, because those are the days that actually count. And give yourself permission to grieve the hurt honestly, instead of skipping straight to healed. You can't outrun pain into a glow-up. You have to walk through it slowly, some days on your knees, and let it teach you something instead of just trying to erase it. A few more things I wish someone had told me 18 months ago, in case they help you the way I hope this whole story has. Find one person who will check in on you on a schedule, not just when you happen to think of it. Consistency rebuilds trust in ways grand gestures never quite manage. If you don't have a Priya yet, consider being one for someone else. Sometimes showing up for another person's healing is the fastest way back into your own. Separate the event from the shame. What happened to you is real, and it's allowed to hurt. But the story you tell yourself about what it means, that you're not enough, that you're a downgrade, that you deserved it, that part is negotiable, and you get to be the one who negotiates it, ideally with the help of a good therapist if you can access one. Track evidence, not just outcomes. A note in your phone, a page in a journal, anything that lets you look back on hard days and see proof, in your own words, that you followed through even when you didn't feel like it. On the days the scale doesn't move, the promotion doesn't come, the loneliness doesn't lift, that evidence file will remind you that you are still, quietly, becoming. And expect plateaus, expect setbacks, expect the sprained ankle, the 6 weeks where nothing on the scale changes, the moment you almost text the person who hurt you at 1 a.m. None of that means you're failing. It means you're human, and you're doing something hard, slowly, on purpose. A few more practical things, quickly, because I know some of you will screenshot this part. Pick one habit you can do in under 5 minutes on your worst day and protect that habit fiercely. Mine was the glass of water and the made bed. It's not about the water or the bed. It's about proving to yourself daily that you still follow through, even in miniature, even when everything else feels impossible. Find one room, physical or professional, where your specific qualities are actually valued rather than tolerated. If a version of you gets called too much in one relationship or one job, it doesn't mean you're objectively too much. It means you're in the wrong room. Somewhere out there is a Renata who's been waiting for exactly the qualities someone else made you feel small for having. Let apologies, when they come, feel nice without needing them to feel necessary.
If you build your foundation on solid enough ground, an apology becomes a bonus, not a lifeline. And that shift alone will change how much power anyone else's opinion has over your days. And finally, give yourself full permission for the flinch to take a while to disappear. Old bracing, old hypervigilance doesn't leave the moment the relationship ends or the moment you hit some external milestone. It fades slowly, in its own time, the way mine did over 15 months of walking into a boss's office expecting bad news before I finally, one ordinary Tuesday, expected nothing but curiosity instead. I think about that hallway a lot still, not with the sharp, stinging pain it used to carry, but almost with a kind of distant tenderness, the way you might think about a scar from an old injury.
Something that used to hurt constantly and now only aches faintly when the weather changes. I don't think I'll ever fully forget the exact cadence of his voice saying "more put together," but I've reached a place where remembering it doesn't cost me anything anymore. It's just a fact about a chapter that's closed, not a live wound I'm still tending. I want to add one more thought here, something I've come to understand only in hindsight, writing this all out for you now. For most of my 20s, I operated under a quiet, unexamined belief that I needed someone else's approval to know whether a version of myself was acceptable. First, my parents, then friends, then, most heavily, Daniel. My sense of, am I doing this right, was almost always outsourced, checked against someone else's face, someone else's tone of voice, someone else's silence in a room. The 18 months in this story were, underneath all the habits and numbers and milestones, really about relocating that authority back into myself, not becoming arrogant, not deciding I no longer needed anyone's input ever again. Priya's counsel, Dr. Okoffer's questions, and Marisol's reframes were all essential, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But there's a difference between seeking input and outsourcing your entire sense of worth to someone else's verdict. I spent 4 years doing the second one with Daniel. The work of this whole story was learning slowly, unglamorously, how to do the first one instead, with people who earned that trust by actually seeing me clearly, not by holding my self-image hostage to their moods. That shift, more than the weight lost or the promotion earned or the half marathon finished, is the actual transformation this story is about. If I could go back and say one thing to the woman sitting on that empty apartment floor, eating cold pad thai out of the container, agreeing with every cruel word a man had said about her, I don't think I'd tell her it gets better, even though it does. I think I'd tell her something closer to the truth. It gets different. You get to build something he never had the imagination to picture for you. And one day, a year and a half from now, you'll stand across a room from him and realize with something like wonder that you don't need anything from him anymore. Not an apology, not a comeuppance, not even his recognition. You'll have already given yourself everything he couldn't. 18 months ago, I was a woman standing in a hallway hearing herself described as a downgrade. Today, I'm someone I'm proud to see in the mirror, not because I became someone impressive to him, but because I finally stopped negotiating with my own worth. I didn't scream, I didn't fight back, I just became someone I never expected. I want to leave you with one last thought, because I think it's easy, watching a story like this compressed into an hour, to feel like your own timeline is somehow behind schedule. It isn't. My 18 months had 6-week plateaus in it. It had a sprained ankle. It had a night with It had entire pint of ice cream eaten over a kitchen sink at 11 p.m. It had 2 texts I regret sending, and 1 letter I had to burn to let go of. If your glow-up looks messier than this video, slower than this video, less cinematic than this video, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it honestly, which is the only way it actually sticks. I also want to say, gently, that not every story like this needs an encounter at the end. Some of you watching this might never run into the person who hurt you again, and that's not a lesser ending. The restaurant window in this story was a nice, satisfying beat, but it was never the point of the 18 months that came before it.
If you never get your window moment, you haven't missed anything. The becoming was always the whole story. The witness is optional. I want to say one more thing before we close, because I think it's the part that took me longest to actually believe, not just say out loud. For most of the 18 months in this story, some small, stubborn part of me was still, quietly, waiting for Daniel's reaction as a kind of final exam, proof, once and for all, that the whole effort had been worth it. It wasn't until that ordinary Tuesday at the kitchen counter, tea kettle whistling, my own reflection looking back at me in the dark window, that I understood the exam had already ended long before the party ever happened. I passed it the day I stopped needing him to grade it. So wherever you are right now, the hallway moment, the empty apartment floor, the 6-week plateau, the 1-year mark, or somewhere so far along you've already forgotten what the old version of you sounded like, I hope this gave you something to carry forward. If this story meant something to you, I'd genuinely love to hear yours. What's your glow-up story? Tell me below. I read every single comment, and honestly, they're the reason I keep making these videos. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and whatever quiet, unglamorous first step you've been putting off, the walk, the notebook, the class you've been afraid to sign up for, I hope you take it today. Not for anyone watching, just for you. I'll see you in the next one.